Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of T.M. Scanlon's book, What We Owe to Each Other. So last chapter was about Scanlon's structure of contractualism. We argued that contractualism is about providing reasons that others can't reasonably reject, and we looked at the different situations in which that applies and what those situations would look like. And more precisely, it was asking about what kind of justification do we have in contractualism for our actions and our beliefs. We asked about what can constitute a reasonable rejection of a principle. We've seen that we need to distinguish between the reasons and values that count as valid and the ones that don't. What principles can be rejected and how, what is relevant in moral argument, like the standpoint of individuals, for example, who should get the priority in moral argument, and what kind of argument is not acceptable in contractualism. Then in the conclusion, we touched on a subject that is essential in contractualism when discussing the difference between Scanlon's contractualism and John Rawls' argument of the original position, and we mentioned the issue of institutions versus individual responsibility. And we haven't really touched on the subject of responsibility yet, which is an unavoidable subject in morality, especially in contractualism, which is based on individuals justifying their actions to others. So responsibility often plays a huge role in determining if one is justified or not for the action they did or they didn't do. So the sixth chapter of this book is about that. It's about responsibility. So first, Scanlon establishes a distinction between two types of responsibility. First, there is what he calls responsibility as attribuality, and second, there is substantive responsibility. So the first one is defined as follows. Questions of moral responsibility are most often questions about whether some action can be attributed to an agent in the way that is required in order for it to be a basis for moral appraisal. So moral appraisal here is kind of a neutral term, which can mean, depending on the situation, that it's either blameworthy or praiseworthy, or it can be morally indifferent. Okay, so moral appraisal basically means moral evaluation. Okay, we're gonna just see if the action is worthy of praise or worthy of blame, or if, you know, concerning morality, it is completely indifferent. It has no moral weight. So basically, the first kind of responsibility is about to see if we can attribute action X to agent Y, and then decide whether agent Y should be blamed or praised for action X, or if that action is morally indifferent. Now, the second type, which is a little bit more problematic, the substantive responsibility, is about, quote, judgments of responsibility that express substantive claims about what people are required, or in this case not required, to do for each other. The example that Scanlon gives is a father who didn't set up his estate to prevent his grown son of making stupid financial decisions. So the son inherits the money, he makes stupid decisions, and then he loses everything. And then we ask, you know, should we blame the father or not for not setting up his estate? Basically, we are asking about the duties that we have towards each other, or the roles that we have to embrace and play. But the second type of responsibility has an issue, which is who can determine which responsibility do we actually have towards others? Who gets to decide what role do we have to play in our lives, you know, in relationship to other people? Like, does the father really have that responsibility towards his kids? So we can be quick to say that the father doesn't have that responsibility, like it was the responsibility of the son to be responsible with his finances. That can be true, but we cannot take it for granted. There has to be a reason why the father setting up his estate is not a substantive responsibility, if we are going to say that it isn't. We'd say, however, that there are other responsibilities that are like that, that are substantive. Some people can argue that the parent has the responsibility to save some money for their kids' education or for their child's marriage. Some would say no, but others would say yes. And we need to know what makes a responsibility a substantive one. Scanlon considers one aspect to to this problem. He says the way in which a person's obligations to others and his claims against them depend upon the opportunities to choose that he has had and the decisions that he has made. So the first thing for a responsibility to be substantive is to ask whether the person has or had the opportunity to choose to do that action. If the son was incapable, he was incapable of spending the money wisely, then someone can have a point in blaming his father for not setting up his estate, because we'd say in the case of the son that the son, chose to spend the money the way he did. He had the opportunity not to waste it, and so his father is exempt from the responsibility of setting up his estate. So we need to know if that's true, if the son really could have done otherwise, So a substantive responsibility is only possible regarding the value of choice. If someone doesn't have the opportunity to do a certain thing, like keeping his money, then we can say that someone has the substantive responsibility of keeping it for him. We'll come back to this distinction between these two kinds later on, because it can be seen that these two kinds of responsibility are basically the same. So we need to give further explanation about that distinction. But what is important here is that any idea of responsibility and choice must be related to the notion of free will. So this notion, the notion of free will, threatens the accounts of responsibility, because if we cannot justify free will, then we'd fall into either one of the following theses: either determinism, which is, quote, the thesis that there are laws of nature from which it follows, given a complete description of the world at any one time, exactly what state the world must be in at any later time. So this basically says that everything that we do is already decided in advance, and so whatever it is that we do, we couldn't have done otherwise. So we never have the opportunity for anything. We never have choices, and so if that's true, then we cannot really be held responsible for anything. And there is the second thesis, which is weaker than the previous one, and this is the thesis that Scanlon is going to go with, and it's called the causal thesis. He says, this is the thesis that all of our actions have antecedent causes to which they are linked by causal laws of the kind that govern other events in the universe, whether these laws are deterministic or merely probabilistic. Now, both of these theses are often illustrated through thought experiments like these. Like, all of our actions and beliefs are the product of outside forces, like electric stimulation of our nervous system. If that's true, then you cannot be held responsible for what you do or believe, since you are literally since they are literally imposed on you. And so as such, actions or beliefs can be attributed to you since you didn't choose them, and you cannot have any any substantive responsibility either, because you have no opportunity to do otherwise. And so although determinism and the causal thesis are threats to free will and moral responsibility, Scanlon actually argues that they're not really a threat. In the case of determinism, it's simply false. In the case of the causal thesis, Scanlon argues that it's a true thesis, but because it's weaker than full-on determinism, it opens a space for moral responsibility that can be filled with other things than the cumulative effects of indeterministic physical processes. Like, in other words, the causal thesis is actually compatible with moral responsibility. And the way to prove this, Scanlon argues, is by showing the relevance of moral responsibility in moral arguments. So he bases the refutation of determinism and the compatibility with the causal thesis through demonstrating the relevance of responsibility, and that's what he's going to do throughout this chapter. So, in order for a principle to be rejected, we have to take into account the role of responsibility and of choice in that rejection. And these are two intertwined notions. They are intertwined with each other. You may have good reasons for rejecting a certain principle, but if that principle puts a burden on you once you betray it by choosing something inappropriate when you had the opportunity to do otherwise, you become responsible for that betrayal, and so you cannot reject the principle anymore. Here we're going to ask ourselves what it is that makes our reasons for rejecting principle invalid because of some inappropriate choice. As Scanlon asks, how can the fact that a person could have avoided a certain burden by choosing appropriately make it the case that he cannot reasonably reject a principle that makes him bear that burden? So here Scanlon introduces another feature for rejecting a principle, or another feature of reasonableness, if you want, and that is the possibility of rejecting a principle depends on what you choose to do. There are things that if you do them, you can no longer reject a certain principle, even if you have good reasons for rejecting that principle. This seems to be some sort of existential dilemma. People don't have to bow to the principles of a minority or a tyrant. They can reject those, but that implies that they are free to make their own decisions, to make their own choices. But since principles are normative, meaning that they tell what is the best thing to do, they must have some force that overrules some choices. Like you no longer have to obey a tyrant, but you are going to obey the consequences of your choices. So you can reject principles, but that comes to a cost. It comes at a cost. It comes at a price, and the cost that not any principle can be rejected in however you want. And so, if you want to keep your let's say, right to reject a principle, because obviously you want to be able to do that in order to be free, then you are going to have to bear the burden of that freedom. And so the first thing that Scanlon goes through in this chapter is the reasons people have to want that freedom, meaning, quote, the positive reasons that people have for wanting opportunities to make choices that will affect what happens to them, what they owe to others and what others owe to them, or the generic reasons that people have for wanting to have what happens depend on the way that they respond when presented with alternatives under the right conditions. So like when you go to a restaurant, you want to see, the food that comes on your plate depend on the choice you picked from the menu. We just need to know why we want it to be that way. Why do I want to be the one who chooses which food I will eat when presented with dish options? So obviously there is an instrumental reason. Since I am eating something that I want to enjoy, then the dish will have higher chances to be enjoyable if I choose it than a dish that I was forced to eat. So I value choice because it guarantees higher chances of enjoyment. So that's the first point. This is called a predicative or instrumental value of choice. Like I predict the effect of my choice. It is both conditional and relative. It depends on my mood, my knowledge of what's on the menu, the capacity to understand what is happening, the nature of the waiter's question when he asks me what do I want to order, my relationship with the people I am eating with, etc. Other values that Scanlon gives are what we call representative value of choice. We want our choices to represent or reflect who we are. Gift giving is an example. So when you buy a gift to someone, you just don't want to simply buy a gift, but you want the gift to represent you as you who gives it to the other person. Like depending on your relationship, you'd want your choice to represent something in particular. If you offer a gift to your wife, you want that gift to be the gift given by you as a husband. Getting the same gift from your husband or from your friend doesn't have the same meaning. So we value choice because it allows us to represent ourselves in the way we want to be seen in the eyes of others. So you know this feeling when you had to be the one who brings bad news to someone. Like you don't want to do it. No one wants to be the person that tells another that you are fired, because that action would represent us in a way that we don't want to. We don't want to be perceived as, inconsiderate or uncaring, and so feeling that we don't have a choice, that we must fire that person, is something that we want to avoid. So this is the representative value of choice. We want to have choices because, well, we can control how we would appear in the eyes of others. There are also symbolic values of choice. Here it's when we want to have the opportunity to do actions that would reflect something important about ourselves. Here we want to be able to choose to do actions that are considered noble or valuable or worthwhile. When we fail or can do a certain action, we worry that it would reflect the judgment that we are, for example, useless or incompetent. The example given by Scanlon is a society where arranged marriages are not the norm. When we want to be the ones to decide who we marry and not have our families or another body decide who we should marry, doesn't just reflect predicative or representative values. It's also about our own self-worth. Having others to decide for us who we should marry is kind of demeaning, and we all know today that being unable to find a mate on your own makes us feel kind of like a loser. On the other hand, I don't think that it's also a good idea to have to base relationship building on that kind of mentality either. But the point is, we value choice because of its symbolic value. It recognizes our self-worth as individuals. Like, this is the takeaway. So these are the three main values: predicative or instrumental, representative, and symbolic. And they are often used as reasons to determine if principles can be rejected when that principle is about, paternal intervention. When your parents intervene in your life because it's for your own good, even if they are right, they seem to be trespassing on those values, and so they are taking away our opportunities for choices. Your dad can be right to tell you not to date someone, for example, or not to go to a certain party because you have an exam and it would be a poor decision to go to the party instead of studying. You'd be like, you're maybe right, but it's my decision to make. So there you're trying to reject his principle of intervention for his child's own good on the grounds of the symbolic value of choice. Like, your dad demeans you by implying that you are immature and incompetent. But you also do it on representative values because your father is taking away your opportunities to represent yourself to the people you want to be acknowledged by. In this case, your dumb, drunk friends. And also you reject his intervention based on instrumental values because you don't want someone to restrict your range or rights for opportunities of enjoyment. Now, of course, it's not sufficient to throw these values at your father to go get wasted at the party, even though the representation of yourself that you will give to your friends by beating them at beer pong or whatever before passing out in your vomit is a representation that the world can afford to miss. Like, the values of choice are not unconditional or sacred, and your dad can have good reasons to reject your principles and those values in the same way that people can have good reasons to reject principles from those who refuse to pay for Social Security because Social Security would be paternalistic, right? Like when you think about Social Security, for example, you can reject people's values of choice. Like, you can say that you have to pay for Social Security even though you feel like the government is coddling you or is diminishing your opportunities to shape your life according to your preferences, or by preventing you from working more hours than what is humanely possible so that you make more, so that you can more money, etc., which of course will go it's a money that will not go to you but to your boss's pockets anyway. So unless you want to end up being eaten by a bear, you pay Social Security. For those who didn't understand the bear thing, I recommend this book right here. A libertarian walks into a bear, sorry, and you'll understand why you have to pay for Social Security, and the values of choice are not and should not be considered sacred. So people shouldn't have the opportunity to do anything that they want, and even if that won't cause harm to others, it's also debatable. There are some choices that should never be available, like walking into a bear's mouth. Now, the controversy surrounding paternalism is basically about that idea. Which choices should we allow people to have, and who's to determine them? Who can have the authority to ask that question anyways? Who has the right to tell me that I cannot drive without seat belts or without a motorcycle helmet? People can always also appeal to history to show that most choices that were restricted came with a huge moral cost. People shouldn't have to do everything they want, often served as a way to force people into marriages with people they didn't even like, to prevent people to enter non-heterosexual relationships. It served as a justification for racism and sexism, etc. You can also add that it was an obstacle for scientific progress, like it demoralizes people who don't want to accomplish anything anymore, since everything they do will depend on the authority of someone else. Like, we never seem to agree on what choices to allow and which ones to restrict, and when we do, we often restrict the right ones and allow the wrong ones, right? So not only that, but paternalism seems to be pretty unrealistic, since it can never accommodate people. There are just too many people with different interests for any form of paternalism to satisfy most of them. Even if we try to be paternalistic only about some small choices, what is small for someone can be big for another. So, quote, different people have good reason to attach different value to various choices and opportunities. The same form of choice can have different instrumental value for people with different levels of knowledge, self-control, and discrimination, different representative value for people with different aims and attachment, and different symbolic value for people in different groups or societies. So, what to do with all of this? Scanlon recognizes the big tension that we have to face, but we can work something out. Now, the values of choice can only be conceived for us if we are capable of something in particular, the ability to make judgments from competing reasons. What is valuable about choice is that it reflects this ability. And this ability is different from the spontaneous and simply, mechanical, instinctive reaction to events. We don't want to be creatures of instinct. We want to be creatures of judgments, because we are creatures of judgments, and anything else would be demeaning for us. But if we were just creatures of instinct, then the idea of choice won't make sense to us, because a creature of instinct can't have the opportunity to react differently than how it reacts. So the only way for us to be creatures of judgments is by being able to make choices. And so Scanlon argues that this is what we have to focus on. When we appeal to the values of choice, what we're really saying is, I don't want to be taken for a creature other than one of judgment, right? So the causal thesis seems to, the causal thesis seems to imply that we are instinctive creatures, not creatures of judgment, and paternalism seems to imply the same. We need to be controlled by others because we cannot make the proper judgments. We give in too easily to our instincts. And so for Scanlon, what is to be preserved through choice is it's not opportunities for action, like we must know what choices to permit and which ones to prohibit, or do we have to allow everything and count on people to make the right decisions? This is not the point for Scanlon. Instead, what is to be preserved is this ability to make judgments. So we can have the causal we can have the causal thesis and even paternalism, quote, as long as the causal processes in question do not deprive us of the ability to make such judgments at all. They do not undermine the value of making choices that reflect these judgments, nor do they affect the fact that being allowed to make these judgments for ourselves is an important form of recognition as competent independent agents. So with this in mind, we can move on to the next section. So now that we understood why the value of choice is so valuable, we can see in what ways does the value of choice determine which principles to reject. As we've seen, choice is about having opportunities to do things and also to avoid them. In both cases, there has to be reasons for why we want the opportunity and why we want to avoid it. For example, consider that your city decides to remove dangerous chemical waste from the ground near to your residential area, and places it in another site where it is safe. But if they dig it up, some of the chemicals are going to go into the air, but it would be less dangerous than letting it stay in the ground. But still, the effects can be quite damaging for some vulnerable people who have, for example, lung problems. So the authorities must warn people to stay in their homes during the extraction and avoid the site altogether. And so the authority must take the necessary precautions to reduce the harm and warn people about the dangers of the operation. They put fences around the site with big signs saying "stay away" or keep out, or danger beware. But despite these precautions, some people did get injured from the chemicals because they got exposed to the chemicals. Now, can those people complain or reject the principle on which the authority acted? Or, as Scanlon asks, what role the fact that they were warned and thus given the choice of avoiding exposure plays in making it the case that they cannot complain of the outcome? So that depends. If we consider the case that someone didn't know about the whole thing, they didn't hear the warning, and they get exposed, depending on whether or not the precautions were taken, the precautions that were taken were sufficient and reasonable, we can determine if that person can complain of the outcome or not. But if the precautions taken were sufficient and reasonable, then here complaints don't really matter. If the authority took all the precaution necessary and that everyone could think of, they reduced the risks to their minimum, broadcasted their message as far and wide as they possibly can, then the person who didn't know about it cannot really demand anything more from the authorities than what they already did. Now, complaint here means that you blame the authority for not doing enough, which in this case is just false. The authorities did enough and perhaps more than enough. So here we're saying that even if someone wasn't warned, the fact that everything was put in place to warn him but didn't reach him, despite doing everything to reach him, means that they cannot complain or reject the principles that the authority acted on. But here we're talking about someone who didn't know about the whole thing. It is different when we consider it from the point of view of someone who was warned, who knew about the warning, and yet decided to go out and even went to the site out of skepticism. So in the first case, although the injured cannot demand more from the authorities than what they already did, he doesn't get blamed for being exposed, since the exposure isn't his fault. He simply didn't know. So things would have been different if he was responsible for his ignorance. Like if he believes in conspiracy theories that the government is controlling your mind through the media, and he'd actively avoid hearing anything that comes from official sources, things would have been different here. But that's the point. When you cannot blame the injured, that's because he didn't have the opportunity to hear the warning. But in the case of the conspiracy theorist, he had plenty of opportunities to hear about the warning, but he preferred using his reason to believe conspiracy theories rather than things that would make sense. So in the case of whether you are responsible for your ignorance or the one where you went to the site because you were skeptical of the warning, you cannot complain either. But even worse, you also get blamed for it. But here someone can say, hold on a minute, someone who is skeptical about the warnings of the government shouldn't be blamed, since it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical of the government. And even the conspiracy theorist that shuts himself from TV, radio, newspaper is clearly, I mean, we can say that maybe he's mentally unstable, so they cannot be expected to reason normally. After all, if the government takes the precautions of reducing the risks for them by putting on the fences and the signs to keep out, it's because they know that some people will not hear or listen to their warning, not because their warning didn't reach the didn't reach physically, but because there are people who refuse to be exposed to those warnings or don't believe in them. So how can we blame them in these circumstances? And so this adds a distinction from the value of choice. And this is what Scanlon calls a four-feature view. Quote, according to the value of choice account, what matters is the value of the opportunity to choose that the person is presented with. If a person has been placed in a sufficiently good position, this can make it the case that he or she has no valid complaint about what results, whether or not it is produced by his or her active choice. On the four-feature view, on the other hand, it matters crucially whether an outcome actually resulted from a conscious decision in which the agent intentionally passed up specific alternatives. So what matters on the four-feature view is the fact of choice, not the faultiness of that choice. Okay, so Scanlon gives an example to illustrate this. He says, imagine a woman who is aware of the warning and decides to leave the house anyways. She is a scientist that works on a project that she really values a lot, and let's imagine that she has other circumstances that cannot let her postpone that project until the end of the extraction. So suppose she has a fatal disease and she will die soon. Now this person is perfectly aware of the risks, of the danger, etc., but takes the decision after assessing all the reasons that she has to leave the house. Now, this person cannot complain at all about the consequences because, as Scanlon says, what lies behind the four-feature view is thus not a notion of desert, according to which people who behave wrongly or foolishly cannot complain about suffering as a result. The idea is rather that a person who could have chosen to avoid a certain outcome, but who knowingly passed up this choice, cannot complain of the result. Volenti non fit injuria. So that's the Latin maxim: to a willing person there is no injury. If you knew what was going to happen to you and you voluntarily act on it and you get injured, then it is not an injury in the sense of you have no one else to blame but yourself. If you regret that decision and be like, I should have acted differently, you had the opportunity to come up with that new judgment back then. And so no one should be blamed for not preventing you or for not doing more than what they already did in terms of precaution. That would be, paternalistic in the very negative sense if, if people intervened. But we should not be tempted by the four-feature view. Because let's go back to the second case. The fact that someone was informed is considered enough for them to be unable to reject the principle. It doesn't matter if they took the decision of leaving the house consciously. All that is needed is that the person was placed in the right conditions to be informed. But if we consider a fourth case, this time it's about someone who knew about the warning but forgot about it. We wouldn't consider that he is not responsible for leaving the house. He was giving the proper conditions to act accordingly, meaning that he was giving the conditions and means to avoid the harm. So unless you can prove that some necessary conditions were not available when they could have been offered, you can't blame no one but yourself, actually. But it can be argued that the four-feature view matters in other cases, offering just the conditions conditions to avoid harm isn't always sufficient. We have to consider if people have consented to those conditions in the first place. There has to be an agreement with the warning for the warning to be efficient, right? Quote, a principle that no one could reasonably reject holds that if one has consented to an argument under the right sort of conditions, then one is bound by it. But it would be reasonable to reject any principle holding that one could be bound by contracts one has not consented to. But this can be explained by the value of choice theory without appealing to the forfeiture view. This is because consent is in itself another condition that is necessary to be able to avoid the harm in question. So it can explain why consent is required in some cases, but not in others. In the case of the woman going out despite being warned, we're not going to need her consent to put fences and restrict people's movements during the extraction. So we shouldn't need more than the value of choice theory, meaning that we only need to provide for people the conditions necessary to protect them. If those conditions are sufficient, then nothing more can be asked for. So these conditions are called background conditions, to which the forfeiture view adds something else. For the forfeiture view, you need to have background conditions and the consent of people. If you don't have the consent, then what people will do under those conditions won't be voluntary, and that is enough to reject principles that demand something from us. And so Scanlon disagrees with this. The only thing that should matter for him is background conditions and not voluntariness or explicit consent. Like in every case where there is an agreement, what should always be present is background conditions. If that specific case demands voluntariness or explicit consent too, then voluntariness and consent are also would just become background conditions. Like this distinction between background conditions and voluntariness/consent is not needed and can be misleading because it would make consent necessary in all cases about in which an agreement is involved. But agreements about not going out when there are chemicals in the air, or about paying social security or staying home during a pandemic do not really rely on consent. Like consider this, if two people agree to a contract but one was aware of an alternative contract while the other wasn't because it was concealed from him. Here the difference isn't that one agreed voluntarily while the other didn't, but that the other had another condition that would play a role in his decision that the other didn't have. But you wouldn't say that you didn't say that one didn't agree voluntarily because he didn't have as much information as the other. So there is a distinction between the various conditions under which a choice is or could be made and the fact of choice itself, which the forfeiture view rejects. For the forfeiture view, remember, only voluntary people cannot complain, and they can be voluntary if they know everything there is to know. So not knowing about an alternative contract means that you are not agreeing on that contract voluntarily. So what the forfeiture view argues for is that giving the choice to people is not sufficient. What they also need is to see the positive value of this choice. Like both people to whom the contract was proposed were given a choice, but only the one who knows about the other contract is aware of the positive value of his choice. And so if the point of the choice of the value of choice theory is to allow people to have choices, then it also needs to make that choice positively valuable. When we return to the case of the imprudent woman who didn't listen to the warning, the initial situation didn't offer her a choice. She couldn't avoid the harm of the chemical until the government stepped in and began removing the waste. Now she has an opportunity to avoid that harm, but by going to the site, she obviously didn't consider the positive value of her choice. And even worse, the warning can be the reason why she went to the site in the first place, because it aroused her curiosity. So to quote Scanlon, the objection concludes that since this moral significance cannot be accounted for by the positive value of being given this choice, we need some other explanation. The natural alternative is something like the forfeiture view. So we have here these two competing views. You have the value of choice theory that says that we can reject principles that don't give us the proper background conditions for the opportunity to make choices, and you have the forfeiture view that says that we can reject principles that we don't consent to. So to solve this tension between the two, we need to see each one's relation with the causal thesis and how each one defines freedom. So value choice theory is compatible with the causal thesis because its appeal is not diminished by the fact that there are outside factors that affect us as long as those factors operate through us. What this means is that when we make a choice because of what we are, then making that choice is compatible with the three values in theory: the predicative, the representative, and the symbolic value. If I eat a pizza because I am hungry and I want the pleasure, and that's what I can afford, and I happen to be in a place where I don't have much variety in food, etc., these are all causal factors, but each of them corresponds to the values mentioned. There is an instrumental value in choosing the pizza, a representative one being someone who loves pizzas and I want to be seen as such, for example. So even if my action of eating the pizza was the result of external factor, they're all operating through me in the sense that they allow me to make choices in the sense we've been describing. Choice means an opportunity to do what I want or ought to do. So on this account, how are we to explain the actions of the woman who ignored the warnings and went to the site nonetheless? So the choice value theory seems to offer no other explanation than she's an imprudent woman. Being an imprudent woman, she'll make the choice that would reflect that. But what about the forfeiture view? How does it relate to the causal thesis? It seems that the forfeiture view would say that someone has to know all of the factors that operate through them, and if they do so, then their actions become their own responsibility, since it's only at that moment when we know everything that we can act voluntarily. So on this account, the woman is responsible for what happened to her because she knew everything about the causes, she knew about the background conditions, the warnings, everything. So the conclusion is that she could have acted otherwise than going to the dangerous site. But this view has a problem that the value of choice theory doesn't. And the problem is that what caused her to act in the way that she shouldn't? Or how can we explain the acting differently if we accept the causal thesis here? This is a question that cannot be answered by the forfeiture view. As Scanlon says, what is crucial in the case of the imprudent woman is not the fact of her choice, but rather the circumstances in which she was placed. So the woman was just placed in circumstances that favored her imprudent character, and that's why she made the decision that she made. So if we hold the forfeiture view, which puts emphasis on the fact of choice instead of circumstances, then we wouldn't be able to reject principles that says that it's okay for a 14-year-old to sign long-term contracts as long as they know everything about the contract. Okay, I explain. The forfeiture view holds that individuals are responsible because giving their knowledge of a situation they could have done otherwise. But as Scanlon says, there are many situations of choice in which someone could have chosen otherwise, but there are conditions in that situation that undermine the force of choice. Example, when people know that they could have done otherwise while angry, while drunk, or overcome with grief. Just because we know what is about to happen doesn't mean that I can ignore the force of the circumstances in which I am in. So for the 14-year-old teenager, it's the same thing. Being a teen, he's less likely to choose wisely. Just like when someone is sad, is less likely to be invested in a project, for example, or when someone is depressed. It doesn't mean that they can't, but they are less likely to do so. And so this less likely to do so is significant, because if it isn't, then no agreement can be invalid, because in all cases, you always have the opportunity to do otherwise. It's like you hold to a view of free will that is kind of radical and perhaps even unrealistic. As Scanlon says, it is often difficult to decide whether these conditions are sufficient to render agreements invalid, but if ability to do otherwise were the test, then it would be obvious that none of them are sufficient. So this difficulty to decide which conditions are sufficient also highlights another problem that the forfeiture view has: the diversity of perspective and standpoints of people. When you consider that what is a predictive value for someone is maybe harmful for another, then it becomes difficult to know which conditions are relevant or necessary. The instrumental value of reducing risks, for example, for many, in the case of the imprudent woman, turned out to be good for the many but harmful for the imprudent woman. So how can we make it so that the imprudent woman cannot complain of the results, since we've ruled out the ability to do otherwise? How can the value of choice theory make the principle reducing risks unable to be rejected on reasonable grounds? And Scanlon answers to this question in two parts. First, it's the generic reason that people want to be informed about possible harms, because people consider avoiding harm valuable. So we inform the woman about the chemicals because we know people want to be informed of such things. And the second is what Scanlon said earlier. It's the fact that all reasonable precautions were taken to reduce the risk of harm. Since we know that there'll be people who will act unwisely, we have to put on fences around the site. Because we offered to the woman the warning against harm, which is something that she herself and others would consider valuable, then we gave her what we owe her and what we owe to others, and because we took the necessary precautions to minimize the risk, then the woman cannot complain about the results. So in other words, all we did was provide the necessary conditions for the woman to avoid the harm, and that's all that we can do. Quote, "I conclude that the value of choice account provides the best explanation of the significance that our choices and other forms of response have in determining what we owe to each other. This account is particularly helpful insofar as it calls attention to the variety of ways in which these responses can be significant and to the importance of conditions other than the fact of choice itself." But someone can still reject to this by appealing to the legal system. In the legal system, we punish people for violating laws on the grounds that they could have done otherwise. So does the value of choice theory undermine the legal system? And so Scanlon gives a comparison between the waste removal and justification to the punishment of crime. In both cases, there is a social goal, the protection of people. There is a way to promote that goal. Protection against this risk. There is protection against this risk by the creation of another, like contamination or punishment, and establishing an area that no one can enter. In case of punishment, it's metaphorical, like it's the area of illegal activities, and so we introduce safeguards to prevent people of entering those areas. Like in the legal system, these restrictions are made so that we have more choices that were not available to us and that we consider valuable. So the choice for protection is obviously one here. And again, choice means having the opportunity for protection. It's not that you have a choice between the protection or ignore it. Without laws, your choices were actually pretty slim, but with the choice for protection guaranteed by the law, then you have more choices than before. So having the opportunity to avoid harm isn't something that we can ignore. So it's important to keep in mind that these two similarities have differences, like the area in which one enters in the case of the waste removal isn't a moral area, whereas the one in the legal system is. Another difference, and more important, is the waste removal doesn't inflict pain intentionally on others. It wants people to avoid contamination altogether, whereas the legal system inflicts intentional suffering and harm on those who violate the law. This difference makes it more difficult for the legal system to justify itself than the waste removal, and it's why it would appeal to the forfeiture view. We can't really think of other reasons to justify harming someone other than he could have done otherwise. Since laws are necessary, then we have to suggest that people can do things otherwise. So for the forfeiture view, it holds the following argument, quote, "A person who knowingly and intentionally violates a justifiable law lays down his or her right not to suffer the prescribed punishment." That is to say, such a person has no legitimate complaint against having this penalty inflicted. And so this is the difference between the legal system and the waste removal, because if a person enters the contaminated area, they don't lose their right to being protected from contamination. If authorities see you entering the area and being exposed, they have to intervene to get you out as soon as possible. In the legal system, however, the authorities don't really protect you, but harm you if you violate the law. And so this adds a heavy burden of justification for the law, because they have to justify why the choice that you made would justify punishment, why that choice is necessary and sufficient for punishment, and why you cannot complain about it. So for the authorities, in the case of the imprudent woman, to just look at her without intervening, you need further justification for why her actions are not protected by the principle anymore. Likewise, the authorities of the legal system must do the same thing with wrongdoers. What can justify intentionally inflicting harm on them on grounds that they can reasonably reject? So Scanlon argues that there are two conditions that can justify penalties on others. He says these penalties can be justified when certain conditions are fulfilled, prominent among which is the requirement that those who are punished should have had the opportunity to avoid punishment by choosing appropriately. The condemnatory aspect of punishment is subject to a further requirement: the condemnation must be appropriate. What triggers this requirement is not the unpleasantness of the condemnation, but the content of the judgment expressed. Insofar as punishment involves an assertion that an agent governed him or herself in a way that was faulty, it is appropriate only when this is true. So Scanlon doesn't go much in details here, but he is skeptical whether the legal system can provide such justification that cannot be rejected on reasonable grounds, because this is the legal system, which isn't about morality but about penalty, and these are two different things. These are different from each other, since the latter is more difficult to justify on reasonable grounds than moral condemnation. I can say that someone has done something immoral, like I can morally condemn someone and can justify that on principle that they cannot reject. But when I move from moral condemnation to I'm going to punish you because of that, then we're stepping outside the realm of morality. And so that's why when it comes to justification for punishment that are based on moral judgments, Scanlon points that this is begging the question, because here punishment is just a consequence of the justification. It's not an element of the justification. So in short, Scanlon argues that the forfeiture view is not a moral theory, since it's not about forming moral judgments, but about the consequences of such judgments. And so he doesn't need to consider it, and that's another that's just the forfeiture view is actually not a problem that is about what we owe to each other. Like, it's another problem that's not concerned with what we owe to each other. So that's it for the first part of this chapter. It's kind of a long chapter, so I decided to make two videos to go through it. So next time we will continue it, and yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully this helped you in understanding furthermore